Today, I'm going to demonstrate one of the things I've struggled most over the years with Laravel. Laravel has incredible testing, and I use it often for APIs. The problem is that when you're working with an API, is APIs are huge, and the amount of data that comes back can be overwhelming. So the beauty of Laravel is it's got something called faking an HTTP request. So what I'm going to show you is this part of the code, which is a PHP Pest subsection. And what you'll see there is I'm trying to add a user to an API. In this case, it's the WHMCS PHP API. So on the right-hand side, I've got array, which is a great tool for outputting data instead of tailing log files and that kind of thing. You can see nice color-coded stuff and variables just look pretty. So let's add a user to the system. So I'm running the pest test here, and I've only got the only here, so it'll only run this test. Okay, and you can see the test passed, and this is the actual results from the API, which is running. I've got a local instance on the computer, and that's what it gives. Now, if I run it again, I'll actually get an error. Let's see. Yeah, exactly. So it's actually added a user twice now, and you can see on the second round I get an error. And this is one of the problems with using an API for testing. It's hard to use a live API. You shouldn't, in fact. So how do you go about mocking an HTTP request? Well, actually, it's dead simple, but it took me years and years to get it right. And the one key I never understood was that when you mock an HTTP API with Laravel and its testing, you can't use the native API provided by the vendor. In the case of WHMCS, it's actually pretty straightforward API. Let's just undo here a bit. I'll show you. There we go. So there we go. This is the sample that WHMCS provides. It uses curl, which is pretty standard for most applications in PHP. The problem is you can't mock curl very easily. So you end up in a situation where testing becomes a nightmare because now you have to learn every single API's way of mocking. Much easier is just convert it to plain old Laravel HTTP client. So you see it's the better version of the code where I actually use the HTTP call from Laravel. So now back to mocking. How do we actually mock this call? So the way to mock a call is actually so simple. It's ridiculous. What you do is I'm going to show you by copying some code from my notepad. Before you call the API, which is actually called by add user, which add user calls this, which calls the API. So if we go back here, before you call the API, you add HTTP fake. And it's simply the URL and the response required. So if I run it again now, let's see what Ray shows us. Boom. So instead of now actually hitting the API, it hits the fake call and produces the output that one would expect for this API. So actually dead simple, but if you didn't know that you should be using the native HTTP client of Laravel, you'd have a problem, which leaves you with a dilemma. It means that you have to wrap APIs using the HTTP client. On the other hand, that's probably not a bad idea because you probably only need a small subset of the actual API for your own application. There we go. Laravel HTTP folks. Beautiful.